Hello, everyone. Welcome to What's the Noise? This is part of the Unanswered Questions series, a collaboration between the New York Philharmonic and John Jay College of Criminal Justice. I'm Raymond Patton, the faculty director of the honors program at John Jay and a professor of history. Today is the final installment of a year-long series exploring the relationship between classical music and social justice. So far, we've explored how the arts can speak out against injustice in the criminal justice system, about the entanglement of George Friedrich Handel in funds from transatlantic slavery, about joy and its importance in pursuing justice. That one was particularly welcome, I might add, and gatekeepers and their role in the music industry. Today, we'll be focusing on the question of noise. What is the difference between music and noise? This is a question that's tied to culture, but also to power, justice, and equity, or lack thereof. As the panelists are speaking, please feel free to post your questions in the chat for our panelists to address. Also, at the end of the discussion, there will be an opportunity for those in the audience to ask any questions you might have. At this point, I would like to introduce Gary Padmore, Director of Education and Community Engagement at the New York Philharmonic. Gary?
Thank you, Dr. Patton. As you just called my name out, my 1-year-old daughter behind me started to speak as well. So I guess she wasn't sure who to, who was supposed to speak from the Patmore household. But in any case, as Dr. Patton mentioned, my name is Gary, and I have the pleasure of being the Director of Education and Community Engagement at the New York Philharmonic. I just wanted to just take this time to really offer my gratitude to John Jay for it's the incredible partnership that we've been able to build with them over this past season. And really, this was a conversation that started maybe 2-3 years ago before COVID. But I'm so excited that we now have this opportunity to really interrogate who we are as an institution, as a community, and even in terms of the art that we create. And so, we're hoping that the folks that are listening to this are also themselves doing some deep thinking and deep listening around, their own work and artistry, especially as it relates to this particular field, especially considering the fact that my 1-year-old behind me will hope to get answers by the time she's up at our age. And so without further ado, I wanted to introduce someone who is certainly a friend and colleague who I met at the beginning of this whole conversation, and that is Dr. Raymond Codrington, who runs the Weeksville Heritage Center in Brooklyn. If you don't know about Weeksville, you definitely need to know about Weeksville because it is one of the dopest institutions in New York City. And so I definitely want to pass it over to Ray. So thank you all again, and hope we will continue this next season.
Great. Thank you for the introduction from Raymond, the other Raymond, and Gary. It's always difficult to follow a cute 1-year-old, but I'm going to do my best. It's interesting because we started, as Gary mentioned, we started with the first unanswered questions session. And so I feel like I've come full circle, but hearing how the panels have rolled out and the content and the subject matter, very important subject matter, but a critical time to be thinking about these issues, especially as it relates to folks that work in the arts, culture institutions. These are questions that I'm also wrestling with in my institution. I'm the president and CEO of Weeksville Heritage Center, and I'll be moderating the panel. And I'm extremely gratified to have Gary and Jeannie as the organizers of this panel. I'd like to thank John Jay for being co-presenters, co-partners in this. As I said, it's a timely topic. I'm really looking forward to getting engaged with the panelists, an esteemed group nonetheless, and I'd like to introduce them. The first panelist will be Elizabeth Helgson, who's the Director of Artistic Programming Administration at the New York Philharmonic. We also have Jennifer Lynn Stover, PhD, who's the Associate Professor of English at Binghamton University and the author of The Sonic Color Line, Race and the Cultural Politics of Listening. And we hope to have Arturo O'Farrell, Professor of Global, on cue. We have Arturo O'Farrell, Professor of Global Jazz Studies at the UCLA Herb Alpert School of Music. Arturo is also a pianist and composer. This panel is, I think, very, very deep, very vast in its range, and we'll focus on a couple of key sets of issues. As I started thinking about the panel, I thought about, so what are we going to talk about? What can we cover and what should we cover? And part of what I thought was thinking about how we as a society and individually come to our ideas and notions about what noise is. Also thinking about who determines what noise is, who is allowed to be loud and why, And how are we conditioned to listen and hear sound differently? And for me, we may not get to it, but I'll just take a little moderator's grace here, is thinking about when is loud being a plus, minus, or when is it neutral? But we all know that nothing is neutral these days, or probably ever was. And there are always stakes involved around privilege, power, race, gender, and class at minimum. All of our panelists can speak to these issues in depth, so I'm looking forward to hearing the conversation. So with that, I'd like to open the floor up to our first panelist, Elizabeth, and hopefully I got your name right, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Ray. Yes, thank you also to the John Jay College and New York Phil for this really great panel. It's been a fun topic for us to explore already together a little bit, and also to just reflect individually. The idea of noise is something that has been kind of primary in my career and in my life as an artist, musician, presenter, and so on for a long time. I started out playing the violin when I was very young, and I was in a musical home. And so it was just a very natural thing. I did have a family friend who was very interested in new music that was written in the last 50, 60, 70 years. So that was my experience with classical music, the Western canon, as it could be called. Was also enhanced with this idea of, but there are living composers, and there are composers that recently passed away, and so on. So I always was somewhat involved with that. And as my career has gone on, I've been more involved with new music, whether it's playing in new music ensembles, working directly with composers, or bringing that to the table in any other organization I work with. New music has sometimes a bad reputation, and we'll talk about that in a second. But when I was in college, I remember someone talking about pop music, and I sort of grew up with it, but not really listening to it actively. And they talked about this experience that they had, which, it's just sort of this endorphin rush, this like loss of themselves. And I just thought, I thought that was for classical music. And all of a sudden my mind was blown, because I was like, oh, there's a much bigger world out there. And I started to look into this idea of how our brains are structured and how we respond to music, and the idea of like a 12-note scale, which is what we're used to in the Western canon, the black and white notes in the piano, doesn't exist everywhere. And the way we respond to a major key or happy music might not sound the same in other cultures and so on. And just discovering that alone was critical for me, because I remember growing up with my mom's poster in her orchestra office. She was a junior high orchestra conductor, that said, "Music is the universal language of mankind," this famous Longfellow quote. But it turns out that that's not necessarily the case, or it's not necessarily that simple. And so in discovering this, I realized, actually, not only are there many different kinds of ways that we gravitate towards certain music as we have an imprint in our early development, but our ears are really sensitive. One could maybe even argue more sensitive than what we see, because there's a theory out there that our first sense of the world is through our ears when we're in utero. And so that sensitivity then is ingrained in us. And it's really helped me realize that actually, when we grow up with a certain kind of music, that's what creates our sense of sonic expectations. And as human beings, we tend to gravitate towards expectations. We kind of like to know what our railings are, what our rules are, where are we supposed to go next? What's next in line? And it's a little bit scary to suspend our expectations. So then I wanted to listen to a few examples of different music. It's very much European canon or a couple American examples. This is by no means an overview of the 20th or 21st century. However, I do have them in chronological order, and we can talk about that in a second. But the first one that I want to talk about is Charles Ives, who is by no stretch of the imagination new music. The piece that we'll listen to a little bit of, also known as the Revival Service, his first string quartet, was written in 1896. And Charles Ives, growing up in Danbury, Connecticut, and in the church, was used to hearing all these hymns. He was used to the sights and sounds of New England. And so he tried to create that with what he was doing. It wasn't about here's a tune I can sing from beginning to end. It was more about kind of the surround sound of the Charles Ives world. So with that, let's listen to a little bit of the fourth movement of Charles Ives's first quartet. So if you listen to any individual part, actually each part kind of makes sense. It's just sort of the cacophony of how they are structured on top of each other. And if you were to listen to the piece over and over again, you start to hear those lines, and then it's sort of like a magic eye that you can't unsee. All of a sudden you'll notice it, but it comes through familiarity. So then fast forwarding several years, although starting kind of around the same time, we have the music of Arnold Schoenberg, again, just as an example, but we start to watch the breaking up of tonality, the idea of a tune not necessarily having that sense of expectation, like here's where it begins and here's where it ends, and I know how to sing this. But eventually he goes into his atonal structure where it's about just really breaking that up. And in fact, that sort of is becoming a more relevant thing right now, or a topical thing, because of a book that was recently published that's discussed in an article in the New York Times that was called Classical Music Doesn't Have to Be Ugly to Be Good. And it's sort of an interesting conversation. What is ugly? What would create that? But what Schoenberg and other post-war then composers are starting to do after the Holocaust was realizing this idea of hierarchy and structure really needs unpacking and really needs to be destroyed. And so that's where we get the kind of birth of atonality. So let's listen to just a little bit of Schoenberg's third string quartet. So not exactly your toe tapping, like, sing along type experience. But again, we're going to fast forward now to America. We've got John Cage, who's not only a musician, but a philosopher. His language is incredibly varied. But what Cage starts to do with his philosophies, and he's actually integrating a lot of Eastern philosophies in his art and so on as well. But he brings in the idea of the onus not only being on the creator of music or the realizer of the music, the performer, but also being on the audience, the listener, the perceiver. And he has this whole idea of how anything could sort of become music. In fact, from his famous credo, the beginning of it is, I believe that the use of noise, wherever we are, what we hear is mostly noise. When we ignore it, it disturbs us. When we listen to it, we find it fascinating. The sound of a truck at 50 miles per hour, static between stations, rain. So the idea is he's creating this idea of a mindful space. And all of a sudden, when we're listening with a sense of curiosity, when we're listening with a sense of intention, it becomes a more interesting dialogue. And again, we're suspending expectations. So I actually had another clip, but I'm going to skip over that for now. But just to say that the classical canon has grown enormously, and the classical canon. So not only do we have contributors from communities all over the world with different sonic landscapes and aesthetics, but we also have a great amount of discovery that's happened due to the archaeological efforts of presenters and of performers. And so we have a number of new voices. And like I said, this was not necessarily just representative of what classical music is, but this idea of learning to listen without judgment, this idea of listening with a sense of openness and curiosity, and knowing that music has this power to change the way that we're hearing things, has the ability to change the chemicals in our brains and so on, makes it such a powerful platform, or perhaps just a stepping off point to start to understand each other and each other's communities.
Elizabeth, that was super, super interesting. And I'm curious as to what that means in the context. Well, two things. What that means in the context of your work, the opening up. It seems like some sort of democratization of the process, and then thinking about audience development. And so what facilitated this? And is it a window that's passing, or do you see it as a trend that's going to continue in your work in places like the Philharmonic, cultural institutions, broader society more generally?
That's a great question. I think that every organization is different. Everyone has a different, some have different focuses. I think an organization like the New York Phil is it's a broad organization. It's got kind of this authority just built into it. And so there's a responsibility there, because there are voices from all over, and there were in times past. And again, this is why this is such an exciting time, is we have a bunch of really great repertoire. We've had this great repertoire for a long time, but all of a sudden this great repertoire is growing, and not just because it's being created in this moment, but why wouldn't we want to embrace that? And I think there is a place for everyone. So yes, I think that this is something that we will continue to see more of. I think it's something where everyone benefits.
And how do you manage that responsibility? That seems like a heavy thing to have on you as an institution, and as I don't know if you consider yourself an arts administrator, but yeah, I mean, how do you balance that out?
Well, I think absolutely. I think just like the listening process, the presenting process is also a process of curiosity and of empathy and of trying to absorb what's around, trying to learn, like, how do we connect with people, and who's listening to what and how. And so even though there's an element of authority, which also could be a laced issue, the authority comes from being really open. And the more open we are, the more opportunities we're giving ourselves, the more opportunities we're giving everyone else.
Gotcha. All right, thanks for that. We'll have a chance to circle back with all the panelists at the end. So thank you, Elizabeth. So for now, let's move to Jennifer Stover. And
Hello. I'm a great follow-up to Elizabeth's conversation, because I bring a sound studies perspective to this question. Sound studies is a field that has a long history, but has had a recent fluorescence, particularly around questions of noise. And also because it puts, it studies the social meaning and impact of sound on its own, and how it's connected to the other sentence, and how it's connected to our social world. And it also actually, one of the things that makes it not music or not musicology is that it asks kind of the question of what happens when we study music as a sound, as one sound among many other sounds and in relation to other sounds. It's a specialized sound, it's an organized sound, but it's not a special privileged sound. Or it asks us, why do we privilege music in this big soundscape of which we are all a part of, where there are sounds of the planet, sounds of other life, sounds of traffic, sounds of, what is music's relation to that? And that kind of allows us to make music strange. It allows us to decenter European art music as the apex of a musical culture. And it helps us understand the long history of it and how and why ideas about music have often been, at least in the US context, real sites of tension and sites of enactment of power. And my particular role in this, I study the linkages between sound and race, as folks mentioned. I wrote this book called The Sonic Color Line. I put the link in the chat. And that began as a way to understand and think about these questions. And I love that it's called Unanswered Questions, because for me, the question of noise, I'm just going to say it's always going to remain unanswered, because it's something that should always be negotiated. That actually us talking about noise and talking with each other about noise, that is culture, that is sociality. And noise is very, very slippery and is something that also can bring people together as much as it can break people apart. And I actually think the sonic color line, the idea that there are sounds that are racially coded and that these become part of the racial hierarchy in the US, I think that's actually an example of trying to solve the problem of noise once and for all, right? Who is noise? Whose sounds are noise? Who are the noise makers? And who are the folks at the center who decide with the sensitive ears, the connoisseurship? I call that the white listening ear. And my book actually traces this in the US all the way back to the 1850s. And right near the end of enslavement, the beginning of the Civil War. And I trace that all the way, through the middle of the 20th century. And that we've actually, our listening is historical. We inherit a lot of these meanings. We learn a lot of these protocols for how to listen and how to judge just by living in this culture. And that's one thing I really want to call attention to with my work. And one of the ways I do that, and one of the people who actually helped me do that, is a sound artist named Tony Schwartz. And I'm really excited to bring him to the conversation today because he has a long history with John Jay University. In fact, he lived across the street from John Jay on West 56th for 60 years, between 1944 all the way to 2008. There is a very, very nondescript church and brownstone connected that was Tony Schwartz's studio, and he recorded over 30,000 pieces of tape in New York City over a time of really dramatic change and changes in the city. And he always believed that noise was editorial. He said noise is an editorial word, that it's not something that we all have a set and fixed idea about. Other than the truly loud noises that cause our bodies physical pain, everything else is in some ways negotiable. And he also said, when you talk about noise, you're talking about a sound that is bothering you. There's no party so noisy as the one that you're not invited to. So yeah, also these ideas about noise and space, noise and belonging. One of the things he did that had a profound impact on perception in the city was to record his area code 10019. Back then it was called New York 19. Tony Schwartz had agoraphobia, and sound recording was a way that he, in some ways, self-therapy for agoraphobia in connecting with the people around him, which was one of the most diverse zip codes in the world. So he would go around recording folks, and he recorded over 10 years the change in the soundscape of Puerto Rican migration to New York City. And he put together a record. He edited all that down to 45 minutes, a sono montage of New York City. It's called Nueva York. And I'm going to play a little bit of that today because I think this clip really gets at this question about music, noise, sound, space, control. So let's have it.
They come by and they watch us dancing out on the streets, and they think it's terrible and disgusting. But, you know, they do the same thing, too, only they do it in the nightclubs.
I'm the owner of the Palladium, the home of the mambo. Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, we got nothing but Spanish people here. We play nothing but mambo music here. We have the greatest music in the country at Palladium. We have 95% Puerto Rican people coming on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And Wednesday night, we have nothing but Americans coming to see us. We play nothing but mambo music. We have a terrific show at 11 o'clock, which is the greatest show in the country. No nightclub, no theater or movie offers you what you see at Palladium on a Wednesday night. I went to Cuba 5 years ago, and being a fan of Latin music, I noticed the mambo there. And I came back here to this country, and I brought it with me, and I tried to introduce it to the public, which we know in a very big scale. At 11 o'clock, which is the greatest show in the country. No nightclub, no theater or movie.
All right, thank you. I'll give a little bit of context to the clip and then open it up to conversation. There's so much happening in that. It's like I said, he works in sono montage, so he's juxtaposing these two recordings. One of young Puerto Rican teenagers having a drum circle in the street corner in their neighborhood, and then juxtaposing it with an interview with the owner, booking agent of the Palladium, very famous dance club. This is around the time of what was called the mambo craze amongst white listeners in the early 1950s. And the juxtaposition there of the young men being hassled for playing drum circles together, using public space to be public, creating music together, and having white voyeurs kind of driving through the neighborhood, like the they in the clip, and calling the kids out as being noisy, as not acting respectably in public space. But then the acknowledgement that, well, I know they love this music when they go to the club. They just think it doesn't belong here. It's one way they love the music, but not the music makers. And also the Palladium, as you heard, was segregated. So white listeners went and danced with, he says American, which is, one of the roots of this issue. So that's segregated too, even in the nightclub. But putting them together, you see how these two performances, musical performances, really feed and reflect each other. You hear the drum circle in the song, in the commercialized version, and you hear here's how musicians start and are born. So what does it mean to try to suppress them and kind of control their life and culture? And Tony Schwartz was really interested in that.
Thanks for that. It was interesting because when you talk about Tony Schwartz, you talk about doing sound-based research and collecting sound in the field. Oftentimes people don't really know what that looks like or what the dynamic is, what the relationship between somebody that's recording and somebody who wants to talk. But it also shows that I'm a cultural anthropologist. I'm going to nerd out for a second.
Oh, perfect. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, one thing you get people to talk about is culture. I mean, it's one thing that people are very open to talking about. So it's good to kind of see the visual and hear the audio with that. But one thing that you said in your work, and one thing that kind of came through in what you just said, what you just talked about, was the idea that listening is a mode of decolonization.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit about that as it relates to what we just heard and your work more broadly.
Yes, I think that, in the talk back that the young man had with Tony Schwartz, there is actually a conscious mode of decolonization in that he's understanding and countering the idea that anything and any sounds those young Puerto Rican men make in public is considered noise, is considered not belonging. Noise is also, another way to define noise is a sound that's out of place. And in kind of codifying sound racially, that also means certain bodies are considered outside of place. And so decolonizing for BIPOC people is kind of challenging that assumption that how you sound is noise. The ways you speak, the kinds of music that you make, the places where you make them, that there isn't anything inherently lesser, which is what the sonic color line attempts to do and to say. I also think for white listeners, this idea of power conscious listening, connected to what Elizabeth brought up, of this sense of openness, but also the sense of your role in the soundscape, and also, the idea that the soundscape is not the property of any one person, any one culture, and constantly thinking about, who am I to be making this decision, make these choices? My sensibilities are not, the law of the land. And so actually really consciously thinking about that. And that's one thing I do. I teach a course at Binghamton called How We Listen. And that's one of the things we both work on, thinking about what decolonizing listening might sound like. We also think about what power conscious listening, how we might enact that.
I would take that class. I would take it. It sounds great.
I would love to have you. You can teach it too.
No, not at all. No, I'm not dope like you. But the other thing is that, you talked about the fetishization of the music and how it was appropriate in some instances, but inappropriate. So I guess the white gaze legitimized it in a way that made it appropriate versus when it was played by, say, Puerto Rican people. It was seen as something that was other, not appropriate, out of place, or no place for it. I just can say a little bit about that, so how the white gaze in turn, it really acts as a legitimizing force in a lot of ways, or space for not just the music that we just heard, but in general for people, as it relates to people of color, BIPOC, however you want to frame it, Black people, Latinx folks, what have you.
I was thinking about it as I was listening to it, that one of the main differences between the young men playing and the song, the recorded song that was played in the background, is that one of them is able to be sold as an experience, right? It's able to be sold on a record. It's the idea that you have to go to a specialized place to listen to it. It's cordoned off. You have to buy your way in to the Palladium to dance. And that's something that Tony Schwartz always challenged. He was on WNYC most of his life with a show called Adventures in Listening. And one of his most famous shows was tons of recordings of San Juan Hill and Lincoln Heights, the two neighborhoods that were very famously razed to build Lincoln Center in the 1950s. And what he did on that show was play years of recordings of people making music in that neighborhood, and acknowledging that, when you build one building for a specialized kind of music and to enable it to flourish, to give it that cultural cachet, you're also losing this entire neighborhood of music makers that were doing it for free, that were doing it in public, that were doing it together. And so, that is one thing I think, it's caused me to think about the commodification of music in a really different way, as much as that enables music to go globally. But yeah, definitely this question about about control of spaces having to do with music. One of the starkest examples I can think of are several urban spaces that have begun to use classical music and European art music as forms of, forms of control, trying to either dissuade teenagers and young people, the troublemakers, from lingering and loitering in the area, and also to make areas uncomfortable for unhoused people to stay. So playing classical music at high volume. And one of the logics to that is, well, it sounds classy. It can't ever be noise because it is the sound of high culture. It is the sound of wealth, all of those associations that it brings along with it, whether or not that's actually true. But, there's precedent for that. In 1921, there was a court case in New York City where a woman who was a cousin or an in-law of the Vanderbilts was having really loud parties playing classical music in her building, and her neighbor underneath sued her. And the judge dismissed it because she brought in so many wealthy people that said, this is, the highest caliber of music. So to judge this as noise would mean that, it would just throw everything out of whack. And that court case was dismissed. That was 1921, but there's still some of that lingering in how we think about music in space.
Probably a lot lingering. So we'll stick a pin in that and come back to it as we round up. So thank you for that. Next up is Arturo. How you doing, Arturo?
Good. How's everybody doing?
Good. So would you like to play your piece and then take it from there? Or would you like to have a discussion?
I think
set up your piece?
I think I'd like to do an experiment. I would like to do an experiment with everybody on the panel and everybody who's listening. I want you to close your eyes and listen. And listen to the space of the room you're in. See if you can pick out anything that's happening outside of the space you're in. And then imagine yourself getting into a deep relationship with any of the sounds that you hear. And what I mean by relationship is, how do you interact in real time? Do you perceive something is happening and then respond to it? Do you respond in anticipation to it? Is there any elements in your listening field that you regard as noise? Are there any elements that you regard as soothing, comforting? Anything that leaves you cold, air conditioning? Anything that leaves you unmoved? Anything? But more importantly than anything, I want you to listen deeply for something you've never heard before in your listening environment. And that could just be the shape of the room. Can you hear the shape? Can you hear the shape of the room? Can you hear the height of the ceiling? And just take a minute, interact with that. And you can open your eyes if you like, but kind of what I'm doing is the result of a talk I just heard on something that's called deep listening, based on the work of the composer Pauline Oliveros. And how we interact with sound will determine whether it's noise or music. And I think that's really important. I think it's a really important element that Jennifer kind of brought up. And I feel, by the way, Jennifer, I feel like I lived that life that you described. I mean, my father was Chico O'Farrell, composer of Irish, German, Cuban heritage. And so I grew up, and I'll talk about being othered in that sense and how I felt othered by the sounds that we made as a people. But yeah, I think the best example that I can think of is, you've been in that restaurant setting and you're trying to have a quiet conversation and someone's just having a great old time entertaining their table and it's noise to you. You get upset. But then do you recall being in that table and having a great old time and commandeering a conversation and you don't feel you're making noise? You feel like you're having a great old time. So to me, the difference between noise and music or just something that is personally acceptable to you is about your interaction with it. And so our little experiment there now is just about thinking deeply about how we interact with sound in general. I had the great composer, arranger Steve Bernstein talk to my class, and he said, he asked the students, what are the three elements of music? And of course, being college students, they said, well, you need melody, rhythm, pitch, and and all the typical answers you'd expect from music students. And Steve said something that was so deep to me that I couldn't believe it. He said, there's 3 elements. First, it has to be enter through your ears. That's it. He didn't talk about pitch. He didn't talk about rhythm. He talked about it has to be sonic, has to be oral. It has to enter through your ears. Then he spoke about, like most students, of course, spoke about rhythm and meter and blah, blah, blah. And he said, then it has to take place over time. So there's an element of time. And then he said the thing that blew my mind. He said, and the third element is really magic. And to me, that element is intentionality. How you interact with a piece of sonic information is how it determines whether it will be noise or music to you. So that's really important to me. The idea that participatory listening is required in order for you to determine whether something is sound or noise. I even went so far as to try and differentiate in my work. We did a recording and a documentary called Fandango at the Wall, in which we brought the Afro-Latin Jazz Orchestra to the border of San Diego to record son jarocho music and to visit son jarocho masters. And one of the things that I tried to do with that recording is also differentiate between the idea of pristine stereo digital separation and field recordings. The medium does not necessarily dictate the quality of the experience. And in fact, a very good example of what you're talking about in what I will call capitalism-driven culture is that one of the things that we know about wealthy people is they spend incredible amounts of money on extraordinary stereo equipment, and they're so proud of it, and then they play whatever it is they could play. Whatever it is they play in the best, most pristine digital realization is humanly possible. And I think that's an example, again, of how race, capitalism, elitism, and all those elements play into what we determine what is noise and what is sound and what is music. Now, there is something called listening and hearing. There's 2 different elements there that we have to talk about. Listening and hearing. Listening is listening with your ears. Hearing is hearing with your heart and accepting the information that is coming to you through your listening as information that will either enhance your life or enhance the life of others. A couple of other things that I wanted to talk about. I wanted to talk about that, and I wanted to talk about the idea that really motivated me, that there was a point in my life where I was just a musician. Where I was playing the piano and going through the motions of having a career and trying to get signed and doing this and doing that. And everything changed for me because of sound and because of the idea of sound and music and because of the idea of what intentionality is in creating sound and music. First of all, I was a little Mexican kid getting off the plane in 1964 and being brought to the United States and seeing my father was a Chico Farrell Latin American legend. I'm telling you, I lived the I Love Lucy scenario. I did that. Right? And somehow I was thrust into the position of being there weren't many Mexican children in the Upper West Side at that point. So immediately I was sent into the PS 166, and somehow they discovered I had a little bit of talent. So I was sent off to the Manhattan School of Music Preparatory Division. I went back and forth on a 104 bus every week with my Bach, my Mozart, and Beethoven. I felt so special because I wasn't one of the regular people, right? Somehow this gave me the impression that the music that I had at home, the music of Tito Puente and Machito and Mario Bazar, was less than. And so it was noisy. The sound of cowbells and congas and the bongos and maracas felt noisy to me. And I started to really disassociate myself from such a noble and royal heritage as Afro-Latin, Afro-Cuban music. This is about distinguishing noise from music because of your participation in it and what your perception of it is. Eventually, through the good graces of incredible friends like Andy Gonzalez, bass player, I learned to love and accept the music that I came up with and to understand that this is music that comes from a community. Now, here's a really sensitive topic. This is music that comes from community participation, like son jarocho music, like Afro-Cuban, Afro-folkloric, Afro-Latin music. It is music that takes place in a communal setting. There's no need for specialists. Pick up a cowbell, you're in the band, right? So in a sense, this is, again, a very important message to the idea of noise versus music. So now one of the things that I want to talk about, and now I'll play an example, but before I play the example, this was the recording that changed my life. This was the recording where I connected my identity as a musician with my soul, with my convictions, and presented a viewpoint that had to do with politics and social reality. I'm going to go there. And by the way, thank you, John Jay College for Criminal Justice, for hosting this. New York Phil, you guys are superstars, man. You're going to change the world. I know this, and makes me so proud to be here today. But one of the things that happened, and I hope nobody gets offended by what I'm about to say, one of the things that happened is it was a terrible, terrible, terrible period in New York City history where we were ruled by a despot, a tyrant of a mayor called Rudy Giuliani. And Rudy Giuliani was responsible for cleaning up the streets and being the tough guy on crime and getting rid of squeegee men. And I mean, like really opening up the door for what became the major gentrification of New York City, especially in black and brown neighborhoods. And the thing that we know is that in black and brown neighborhoods, when they get gentrified, the first thing that happens is they call the police on the noise. That's the first thing that happens. Now, I grew up in New York City, and I grew up in those very same drum circles that you're talking about, Jennifer. I used to go into Central Park and Prospect Park and Marcus Garvey Park, and man, my friends would be playing. Eddie Boulbay, my dearest friend who just passed away, was a master at those drum circles. And it's incredible to me that was the sound that I grew up with, that was the sound that I loved. And all of a sudden people were moving into Harlem and into Brooklyn and to Park Slope. And Rudy Giuliani sent the police out to arrest the drummers, to confiscate drums. And this beloved thing that I grew up with, that I associated so much with myself and my life, and that I eventually re-embraced, was gone. And so it got me thinking about, and I saw a doctoral thesis on this very topic, that somehow this mayor became, the drum was somehow offensive to the gentrifiers. And so it's truly an example of how noise is perceived by some. The drum was used as a military weapon to go into battle, to scare the offensive, whatever, to scare the people you were conquering. It's also used to pray to the orishas. It's also used to communicate love and language and culture and art. And so I wrote a piece called The Offense of the Drum. And the first selection here is my interpretation of the Giuliani years. It's canonic. It sounds fugal. It's very clearly militaristic. And I'll let you listen to that first. So this next piece, and you can clearly hear the militaristic beat. You can hear the disorganization of the saxophones. You can hear how the drummer is trying to break out of this. How the drummer's trying to break out of this prison and can't. And so the second segment I'm playing for you is what I call the beautiful reality of the African rhythmic code, the DNA that is at the heart of all popular music. And I'm not saying popular because it's cheap. I'm saying it's popular because it's relevant, because people will interact with it in this participatory manner that I think is such a defining feature of how we determine what is noise and what is music. It falls along socioeconomic realities. It falls around elite realities. It falls along all these lines that we've all been discussing today. This is my interpretation of rhythmic freedom and the African rhythmic code that sets us all free. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, that was a lot. You came in at the end and just kind of like slid in. We had no warning. You dropped it on us. Thank you for that. And to start with active listening, which I actually did today. I was on a school trip with my daughter in the Brooklyn Botanic Gardens, and I closed my eyes and actually tried to do that. And it does make a difference, and it makes you feel very centered and grounded. But then to end with the rhythmic code that sets us free is a very more than appropriate place to pause for a second. And I'm just curious. So, what does freedom mean in relation to listening and noise? How are the two linked?
I mean, freedom is okay. This is going to get quasi-spiritual. Freedom is you. Freedom is freedom is how you interact with life. To me, the ultimate definition of freedom is service to others, art in service to others, politics in service to others, governance in service to others. And when you do that, when you actually have the freedom to see that you are not the center of attention, you listen differently. You stop talking maybe so much, and maybe you listen more. Maybe you take an opportunity to express freedom. To me, freedom begins when you serve others. And so to me, that involves every aspect of our lives as artists, as educators, as communicators, as administrators. Stop, listen, serve others. That to me is the beginning of freedom.
And we have about a minute, but one thing that you said when you're talking about, I wouldn't say, you didn't frame it as a democratization of the music, but you talked about the need to not have specialists and the participatory nature of the work. Could you just say a little bit more about that in relation to the way you see noise and sound?
Yeah, well, I'm a product of elitism. I'm a product of standing on a stage and performing to a seated audience. I'm a product of that world. I'm also a product of the world where you pick up a jarana at a fandango and you just play. And to me, the two are so similar in intent, but different in presentation. Because we structure it, because it's a symphonic orchestra is an expensive thing to do. We structure them in structures of socioeconomic elitism and power. And of course, people will, yes, like the lady in Park Avenue who was blasting her music. There's also a lot of funding. But frankly, the specialization between a classically trained violinist and a jarana player who's a master player is virtually the same. The years and years of playing in a community setting are equivalent to the years and years of conservatory training. I'm a conservatory trained composer and artist, and I didn't learn to play a single note of music till I got out into the world and started playing with others. I mean, that to me, that specialization, that hybrid specialization instantly melts because you become part of the world.
Gotcha. We have to open up the floor, but I'm just curious. So you don't see it as a kind of music or canon code switching? The two sides should be able to integrate and move between each other.
We're doing a concert. By the way, New York Phil, if you're listening, I'm just saying, we're doing a concert on Friday at the Royce Hall with the UCLA Afro-Latin Jazz Orchestra and the UCLA Philharmonia and Cornell West. So we're like racing borders. We're destroying walls. I mean, we're taking apart the whole thing, and we are definitely this is high, this is as masterful as it could be, but also street, also horizontal. We're doing this. We're taking away this structure and putting it here.
We like that. I think it's time to open it up. Are we good with that? Opening up the floor to some questions?
I didn't know if you could see my hand, so I thought I'd pop in there.
Yes, I see you now. Yeah.
All right. If you don't mind me asking a question, it's not fully formulated yet, but it's something about how genre intersects with this question about noise and power. And I couldn't help but notice, that the sort of the examples of noise and your presentation, Elizabeth, Cage, Schoenberg, Ives are all sort of now part of the canon. I wonder to what extent is that about genre? Is it about class? Is it about race? And if we were to talk about noise in the hip hop world, how would that be similar to? How would it be different from talking about noise in the context of classical or jazz?
I'll take a stab at this for a second, just because it just so happens that, I also embrace spoken word and hip hop and all the different worlds that are so central to society today. A student asked me if there was such a thing as bad music. Evil music is what he said. And I thought about it for a second. I realized that it's difficult question. And what I came up with was this: music designed by algorithms to extract funds from and turn people into robots is evil music. That's a genre that doesn't fall into hip hop or country and Western or jazz. It's the idea that there's a transactional need in that relationship that turns, for me, that turns music, whether it's turntable music or classical violinists, that turns it into evil. So that would be my answer to your question.
I think from where I'm sitting, in terms of thinking about something like connecting the examples Elizabeth brought up, and thinking about something like hip hop, is that a lot of times something we consider noise is actually, I don't know, a sound that we're not ready for yet. That some of the most out there artists who are connected into that freedom of listening and creating are actually hearing ahead of us, right? That's part of the role of the artist. So a lot of these innovators, our listening is historical. What sounds innovative 100 years ago now is part and parcel. We get to repeat music and hear it over and over. In the case of hip hop, part of why it was considered noise is because most of the music critics in the 60s and 70s were white men who were the rock critics, right? The rise of Rolling Stone and Cream and everything, trying to understand what hip hop was without actually, I guess, humbling themselves and actually learning to listen to it, right? It's like, well, I'm a connoisseur of music, so I can judge all the musics as opposed to learning the norms. So I have Trisha Rose's book here. The first dissertation and book written on hip hop is called Black Noise. It's both, it's a play on words in the sense of, she was told not to write the dissertation, that this wasn't a worthy music of writing a book about. So challenging that, but then also thinking about noise as sounds that challenge, thinking about something like Public Enemy's Bring the Noise, that they are also can be sounds of empowerment and resistance and to shake things up. But within hip hop, noise doesn't sound like music to the makers. Or if it does sound like noise, that means, right, something's new in there or something that doesn't seem to fit. So, that's, I think, but that conversation, like, we need to learn to listen to each other's musics before we try to just silence them.
And this isn't necessarily directly related to your question, but I also think tangentially it's important to think about the context of genre and how it's not a thing of the past necessarily, but with more genre bending works and more artists producing things that kind of challenge that notion, that I think opens up the listening experience. And it all goes back then to that exercise that Arturo had everyone doing, just related to like, how does a room come to life? How do people enhance that? And then on top of that, is it organized sound that makes that a new layer of that, or listening is listening at the end of the day. And there might be certain things that we're more familiar with and things that we're less familiar with. But I think as everyone kind of agrees, it's worth the investment of being part of the less familiar to have a better understanding of even the familiar, even the things that make us us.
Just a last point on this, and it's not a genre related response, but Elizabeth, I wanted to just follow up on something that you talked about earlier. I don't know if it was in our discussion today, but we've had this point has come up earlier around accepting or developing the musics and the role of empathy in that. Could you just say a little bit about that empathy and then the notion of community building through listening and sound?
Absolutely. I read a blog post a couple months ago, just generally talking about one person's experience with, he was very familiar with, again, classical music, new music, etc. But a friend of his was trying to convince him of actually, coincidentally, hip hop. And it was someone that he knew, someone that he trusted. And so even if it wasn't a genre that he personally kind of hung his hat on or felt comfortable with, because he knew and trusted this person, he's like, okay, I'm along for the ride. And so he started to explore the genre. And I think with certain like contextualization and with more research and so on, it kind of brought him along, but it was that human connection first that got him to a place of being able to open up his world. And the way that then kind of builds our communities and builds our sense of our world is, I think, incredibly powerful. I mean, I know, the first time that I ate Pakistani food, I was just like, okay, this is new. I'm from the Midwest, so anything is new. But and the next day I felt like a new person. Like I was just like, oh my gosh, that was an incredible experience. And it was a place that, there's a trust building, and eventually you realize that there's a whole other world out there that you want to explore. And I think that's very much aligns with what we do in music too, and in the arts.
Okay. No, thanks for that. So we do have a question from the chat. I'm going to read it word for word. It says, excuse me, uprisings and insurrections are noisy, and music that disrupts are necessary noises. Can music as resistance be learned/taught, or are these more organic and of the moment?
Well, I'd love to take a stab at that one.
Go for it.
Songs of resistance are never, they're always organic from my perspective. They're always responses to mechanization of humanity. So it's not something that you can learn, because it's such a site-specific moment. When I was a student, when I was a kid, when I was in high school, there were no jazz education colleges. It just didn't exist. And if you wanted, for me, jazz is revolutionary music. But if you wanted to learn it, you had to go to some club in downtown New York on the corner of Eldridge and Rivington and hang out there and wait for older musicians to give you nuggets of wisdom. That's organic. That's organic. That's not creating, not finding a created methodology for yourself, for your entry point into doing something that is seen as resistant. And I think it's very important to recognize that while you can't teach resistance, you can encourage it. You can encourage people to question everything. And that really is important, to ask people to question everything. Why do we listen to this? Why do we colonize this curriculum? Why do we consider this canon? Why do we consider that not canon? What happened to this? And I mean, just everything. Everything you read has been written by the winners. Everything you listen to has been composed and performed by the winners. And it's time to destroy those notions. It's time to destroy those notions. You can't teach resistance, but you can sure as heck encourage people to resist.
Can we change who the winners are? Can other people win? Go like,
yeah.
Part of what I think makes it of the moment is that it is a coming together to reclaim public space as well. So it's also very time and location based. I'm thinking about going back to hip hop, thinking about the early hip hop DJs, getting together in parks to have fun, right? Peace, love, unity, and having fun was what how Africa Bambaataa described early hip hop, that it was about Black and brown people experiencing joy and togetherness in a hyper-policed public space in a part of New York, then the Bronx, that was completely dismissed and disinvested in by the city. So it's also can be about joy, pleasure, together, and kind of publicly coming together. The more we're having this conversation, like how, when, and why we can be in public is so much at the heart of this.
I'm curious, why is hip hop coming up in this discussion so much? Is it a coincidence? Does it mean something? I'm just curious.
Again, there's talk about Mos Def and talk about Jay-Z. They're two opposites in such very, very specific manners. Both are brilliant. Both have done incredible, what many people consider genius work. Kendrick Lamar. This is incredibly important music, and it's also music that's it's occupied by really nameless, talentless, baseless people. So I don't want to say names, but I'm saying that there's really, but to say that hip hop and spoken word is not the language, the lingua franca of an entire disproportionately Black and brown community is to ignore that community. And I think that's a social crime. So I think everybody's talking about this because, first of all, you either love that music, or I got to tell you, I love that music. But when it's right on, it's powerful. And, I also listen to Messiaen. So I go from Messiaen, to Kendrick Lamar. So, but yeah, I think it is important music, and it's important to talk about. It's important to talk about why it is not. It's disproportionately ignored by the Academy, for instance, and disproportionately and tethered to other realities in the Academy. And I'm talking about the NARS, the National Academy of Recording Arts and Sciences, and then too that it's ignored by the Academy, the institutional world, in a way that is not very cool, But
I was just going to say 9 times out of 10 when I'm teaching, when someone knocks on my door to tell me to turn the music down or off, or opens the door expecting me to be having a party, which happens a lot. I'm playing hip hop and teaching about hip hop to students. And that actually happened to me when I was studying at Cornell University at the hip hop archive that they have there, the hip hop collection. Yeah. I was listening to Africa Bambaata's board tapes for my new project. And someone who was in there studying something else just, turned around to me and asked me to turn the music off. And I said, ma'am, I'm here to study this music the same way you're here to study the medieval manuscripts or whatever it is that you're studying. And just the assumption that if I'm listening to hip hop and it's audible, that it has to be, it does not belong in the academic space or the archive. That's just really.
That's happened to me many times as well, where I'm teaching and somebody knocks on the door and says,
well, Arturo, I was talking to the Africana department here at Cornell, and they said every year they have African drumming at their end of the year party. Every year someone calls the police on them at Cornell.
Unbelievable.
Every single year.
Unbelievable.
So ultimately, this panel could have been about your experiences on campus and at your various jobs, which I think is an interesting statement about exactly the issues that we're talking about, the controlling and policing of space, sight, sound, and noise, and who gets to say what is acceptable, both in the Academy, in the canon, and what have you.
Oh, I was just going to simply kind of tack on to what Arturo was saying about the organicness also of people raising their voices together, and just how historically there have been traditions of that, battle cries, and even in the church you have battle hymns, and the way that during the apartheid, people would come together as a community, lifting their voice in 40-part harmony and so on. And so I think it's just, obviously music is a very powerful tool for society. And certainly, as Jennifer points out, it can be used for bad, and it can also be used for good. And the onus is on us to bring our empathy to the table to make it as good as possible.
Thank you, everyone, for allowing us to go a couple of minutes over. I want to shout out New York Philharmonic, John Jay College, Arturo Alfaro, Jennifer Lynn Stover, Elizabeth Heldson, the entire audience. Sorry, Elizabeth, I'll get you next time. The entire audience, students, be well, take care. Thank you, everybody, and hope to talk to you again.
And also a shout out to Raymond Codrington, our amazing moderator. Thank you.
Oh yeah.
Thank you, Barry. Thank you, Jean. It's been amazing working with you this year. The work you're doing with the Philharmonic and really expanding access and expanding the conversation is something that our students are very inspired by. Thank you for all your work. Thanks, everyone.